Hello and welcome to Music of Who. This is the second in a run of 3 videos based around the leitmotifs for the 13th Doctor's companions Graham, Ryan and Yaz. In this video, I'll be taking a closer look at Ryan's theme. If you're not familiar with it already, here it is in its simplest form. Now Ryan's theme is the longest out of all the companion themes, but it's all built around one central idea, that ascending pattern of 3 consecutive notes. With the exception of the second bar, which alternates between a semi-breve and 2 minims, the rhythms are identical each time the phrase recurs. The notes are pretty similar too, the melody very clearly contained within the first 5 notes of the scale. In terms of pitch, the majority of intervals are stepped seconds, baby steps between consecutive notes rather than big leaps up or down, though there are some more considerable drops between phrases, and a bigger jump up in the last bar. So how does this all pertain to Ryan? Well, each of the 13th Doctor's companions face challenges and struggles in their everyday lives, but Ryan's are particularly acute due to his dyspraxia. Throughout series 11 and 12, we see him grapple with riding a bike, climbing ladders, facing down Sniperbots, jumping down a parcel chute, saving his dad from a Dalek and the pull of a supernova, trying to get a basketball in the hoop, working out how to stop a plane from crashing, and many more. Tasks which are all made more difficult by his coordination disorder. For want of a better phrase, the baby steps of Ryan's theme reflect his response to these challenges, each rising pattern a metaphor for the progress he makes in the face of adversity, and each drop, between bars, symbolising the setbacks he's faced with. The small jump up at the end of the phrase is significant, as it's the first case of anything other than a rising second, a rising third. It's a small improvement, but an improvement nevertheless, which shows that, just as Grace tells us,
"You'll do it if you keep on trying."
Of the 3 companion themes, Ryan's appears on the officially released soundtracks for series 11 and 12 the least. It's the second to appear in the show itself, introduced in the opening moments of The Ghost Monument, as Ryan wakes up on Angstrom's ship and ponders how he ended up in space.
Where are we? On a spaceship.
My spaceship?
Who's that?
She says she's the pilot.
We were in space. No way.
Played slowly without any syncopation, this is more of a suggestion of the theme than the full thing, which will be established later in the episode. On closer inspection, however, it is essentially just the 4th phrase with the final note down an octave.
Where are we? On a spaceship.
My spaceship?
Who's that?
She says she's the pilot.
We were in space. No way.
A similar, simplified version of Ryan's theme underscores the moment his Call of Duty stunt goes a bit pear-shaped. This time it's played in D minor, the most common key for Ryan's theme overall.
Where's the reload? Where's the reload?
Made it worse.
The first time we hear the motif in full is towards the end of the Ghost Monument, when Ryan's faced with climbing a ladder back to the surface of desolation. Again in D minor, this version is identical to the one from my introduction. It sets the template for most variations that follow. We start on the 3rd note of the key chord, moving up to the 5th and down to the 1st, and the chording underneath is static, nothing more than a couple of held drone notes.
You okay?
It's not my favourite thing. Climbing ladders under pressure.
Can I just say, you are amazing.
Am I?
Think what you've gone through to be here.
In the following story, Rosa, the first 2 phrases of the motif are heard as Ryan boards the bus, before morphing into Yaz's theme. Once again we're in D minor, though the chord switches to C major halfway through, which fits comfortably with the E on which the second phrase begins.
The driver let me on at the front of the bus. What does that mean for where I sit? Obviously not a lot of Pakistani heritage around here.
Ryan's theme is next heard in the Tsuranga Conundrum, in the key scene in which he details the circumstances of his mother's death. This is the first of two instances where the motif is played incredibly slowly, stretched out to 80 seconds.
I never knew.
I never knew life threw that sort of stuff at you. I never knew that when it does, sometimes adults don't cope either.
Your dad.
I get it.
The motif is played once in full, then repeated, ending the second time on the third phrase rather than the fourth. This makes it feel somewhat unresolved, matching Ryan's character arc at this point in the series.
People always said that I looked like her. You must have found that hard. Why am I even talking about this? Come on, 4 minutes to the briefing.
Later in the same episode, Ryan's theme features again very briefly when he's imploring Yoss to be a good dad. Personally, I found this one particularly hard to spot, so well done if you noticed it too. As in Rosa, it's just the first two phrases, but there's a catch. The motif itself is played in A minor, but the chording below is D minor, which makes it not too obvious to the ear unless you're listening very carefully. And finally, we've got a variation that you can hear on the Series 11 soundtrack, as part of the track Resus 1. Next, it's Kerblam, and I ummed and ahed about whether to include this one or not, because it's simply an ascending motif, and one comprising 4 notes rather than 3. But I'm fairly sure it's intended as a variation of Ryan's theme, since it underscores the scene of him on the conveyor belt. You can find this cue on the Series 11 soundtrack right at the start of the track Help in Despatch. The motif returns in It Takes You Away, this time played in A minor as Ryan discovers that the growling monster supposedly haunting Hannah is nothing more than a couple of speakers.
Oh, you gotta be kidding me.
Then it's back to E minor for the variation played in the Battle of Ranskoor Kolos, when Ryan and Graham suddenly find themselves under attack from Sniperbots.
Sniperbots! How did they get here? He's built an army of them! No, more of them! We're trapped!
The following story, Resolution, is the one which features Ryan's theme most prolifically, no fewer than 4 times in total. First off, there's the notorious cafe scene in which Ryan has it out with his estranged dad Aaron. This is the second of the 2 slow variations I mentioned earlier, the first being the cue that underscores a similar scene about Ryan's mum in the Tsuranga Conundrum. The music here is identical, albeit for the fact that it's in C minor rather than E, establishing a neat consistency and continuity between these 2 connected scenes.
Maybe when things were difficult, you get it wrong. But by the time you realize you got it wrong, it's too late. You can't fix it because the damage is done.
The motif returns at the episode's end, as the arc between Ryan and Aaron reaches its climax. As Ryan tries to save his dad, finally offering to forgive him, we're treated to what is, in my opinion, easily the most beautiful variation of his theme, played on strings and fleshed out by an accompanying counter-melody, the middle line on the score. The genius of this variation for me is that the melody line is identical to those of previous versions. It's just the chording which has changed. The melody itself is simply repeated in different octaves, starting on the B flat below middle C, then going up an octave, and finishing at a triumphant 2 octaves higher. In terms of key, we move between G minor and E flat major, the B natural right at the end signalling a hopeful modulation to G major. As we resolve to G major, Ryan's theme is heard again, starting this time on the 5th degree of the chord rather than the 3rd, as in previous versions. In fact, the melody line here is identical to the D minor variations we looked at earlier, but supported by major rather than minor chords. For the eagle-eared amongst you, this particular variation is layered over part of the team theme for the 13th Doctor and her fam, a motif which is present in practically every episode of Series 11 and 12. But more on that in another video. The episode ends with one final rendition of Ryan's theme as he says goodbye to his dad. We start in G major, but the introduction of C and D sharps very quickly shifts us to E major, in a repeat of the chord progression from before. All 3 variations from the end of Resolution can be found on the Series 11 soundtrack towards the end of the track, Me and My Mates. Like Graham's theme, Ryan seems to appear considerably less in Series 12 than it did in Series 11. Ironically, the most prominent occurrence is before the series has even got going, in Spyfall Part 1, as part of the reintroduction montage for the companions. Ryan's segment begins this sequence off, backed by a very rhythmic rendition of his theme, back in D minor, which layers together the full and simplified versions. We begin with a low-pitched version of the full motif. This is then repeated with a high-pitched rendition of the simplified version added over the top as a counter-melody.
So next week?
Latest. Well, you can play now, man. You never used to step in the car.
I should have got it in.
Moving on to Spyfall Part 2, there's what I think is a glimpse of Ryan's theme as he's working out how to land Barton's plane safely. Like the example from Kerblam, this one's nothing more than an ascending pattern of 3 notes, but since it underscores a Ryan moment, I'm counting it. This cue's featured on the Series 12 soundtrack towards the start of the track, Don't Panic. And finally, the first 2 phrases of the motif appear in Nikola Tesla's Night of Terror, as Ryan reflects on life before the Doctor with Miss Skerritt.
I was at home, normal life, work, then boom, the Doctor changed me all life.
I was the same before I met Mr. Tesla. I wanted my own career, something steady.
So to recap, the ascending pattern of 3 notes which forms the basis of Ryan's theme is a neat musical representation of his persistence. That old maxim, if at first you don't succeed, try again. It's sometimes played in full and sometimes as a simplified version, extrapolated from the 4th phrase. usually with static chording underneath, and usually in a minor key. The lush, orchestrated version in resolution a welcome exception to these rules. Once Ryan's arc for Series 11 has come full circle, the motif is heard a lot less, though it can still be glimpsed in a handful of Series 12 episodes. Thanks a lot for watching this episode of Music of Who. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you're new to my channel, please make sure you subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you again for the next one.